Hello, everyone. I'm François Picard. In the Strait of Hormuz, both sides testing a ceasefire that seems on the brink after earlier reports that Iran had fired on two ships, a claim that two U.S.-flagged merchant vessels had been escorted through as part of President Trump's Operation Freedom. The latest news, and you can see it on this map, though, is the UAE stating that 4 missiles crossed the Strait of Hormuz, targeting the Fujairah terminal, which is a key link for the export of oil from the UAE. There are reports of a fire at the complex. Gabriel Nadler has more.
On day one, Project Freedom threatens to strain an already fragile ceasefire. Washington denied a report from Iran's Fars news agency on Monday that a U.S. Navy warship was struck by Iranian missiles while trying to enter the Strait of Hormuz.
The Navy announced that it prevented the entry of American Zionist enemy destroyers into the Strait of Hormuz, with a decisive and a rapid warning from the Army's naval forces of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
U.S. President Donald Trump's Project Freedom, which he touted as a humanitarian initiative to evacuate vessels trapped in the strait, was set to go into effect on Monday. U.S. Central Command said it had already escorted 2 U.S.-flagged vessels through the strait, and that U.S.-guided military destroyers have entered the Gulf as part of the project. There were no signs of increased vessel traffic through the strait on Monday, marine traffic data showed. On Fox News, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent urged China to assist its efforts to open the strait.
Let's see them step up with some diplomacy and get the Iranians to open the straits. They are trying to cut off international freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz, and the U.S. is opening that up.
Iran has warned it would consider any U.S. attempt to interfere in the sea passage a ceasefire violation.
And that brings us to our Spotlight segment. And we go to Tampa, Florida. Peter Apps is the global defense commentator for the Reuters news agency. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24.
It's good to be here.
Is the ceasefire over?
I don't think it's over in the sense that the conflict isn't over and the negotiation process isn't over either. They'll both keep running until at some stage shipping starts running again. But it's obviously looking at the most strained it's been so far. And when you start throwing drones at oil refineries, as the Iranians are looking like they're doing, clearly both sides are in the mood to escalate. The Emiratis will almost certainly be having quite complex discussions with the US. We don't know whether the UAE will be pushing for more US strikes on the Iranian weapons installations that launch those attacks, or maybe asking them to hold back. But I think the most interesting thing is what we just saw from Scott Bessent, this beginning to put the whole sort of pressure on China as the country that is expected to sort this out ahead of Donald Trump's visit to Beijing in just under 2 weeks' time.
And how much traction will he get?
I mean, I think I was reading some Chinese media this morning. I mean, the word is that the Chinese are going to take seriously any request that the Americans make of them. So what that really means is that if there's a particular ask, and the particular ask is fairly obviously going to be allowing shipping to resume through the Straits of Hormuz, then the Chinese will take that seriously. But of course, they'll want something in return, and what they want in return may very well be the US backing off on Taiwan. So at the moment, the US is delivering particularly significant weapons packages to the government in Taipei. That really, really angers the government in Beijing, and you'll see them trying to push the US to try and step back on that.
Let's break down some of the claims and counterclaims. First of all, I mentioned at the outset drones. I'm reading over social media that the defense minister of the UAE says it was cruise missiles launched by Iran at its territories. And again, this Fujairah oil complex is key.
Yeah, I mean, we're dancing on the head of a pin here with definitions. I mean, a missile is usually something driven by a jet. And I suppose we sort of think that drones are quite often driven by propellers, although things like the Iranian Shahed have a variety of propulsion systems, including jets as well. So as to whether something is really a cruise missile or a drone is really a matter of definition. But what we really are seeing is the difficulty of protecting everywhere So the US in particular has got very good at counter UAS, so counter unmanned systems to protect, say, its military installations and its warships. But it's incredibly difficult to protect absolutely everywhere, particularly when you get into large installations like refineries. And again, there's, as we've seen in Ukraine, there's this constant sort of battle of getting through jamming. And clearly, as of today, the Iranians have the ability to push something through whatever defenses the Emiratis, the Americans, and quite possibly the Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians are now helping the Gulf states put up around that Faraja petroleum site.
And they did not pick this target by chance. Last week, the UAE announced it was leaving OPEC, and doing so because it felt that its partners weren't hawkish enough when it came to Iran, in part.
Yeah, I mean, the UAE is running a really interesting foreign policy at the moment. Of all of these kind of middle powers, and particularly of the Gulf powers, the UAE is in some ways the most assertive, the most individualistic. So it's already been pushing its own agenda in Sudan. It's been pushing its own agenda in a variety of other places. And it's clearly decided that it's just not going to take OPEC direction on what it does with energy policy. When it comes to dealing with Iran, they are very hawkish. They're also very hawkish against the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, those kind of associated groups. And of course, they have that pipeline, which you can see from that map, be very helpfully put on the screen, allows you to bypass the Strait of Hormuz. Now, obviously, the more that terminal comes under fire from Iran, the less it's an option for ships to pick up anything from that pipeline that runs through to the very opening of the Indian Ocean. So they're hitting that terminal because it stops the Emiratis from bypassing Hormuz. They've hit it because presumably it's possibly a bit less well defended than some of the other locations that they've hit already. The UAE, and they've also gone after the UAE because the UAE has complicated relationships. I think is probably the best way of putting it with all of its friends at the moment. The Saudis, for example, we know are talking to the Chinese, and they're putting pressure on the Chinese to encourage the Iranians not to strike at Saudi Arabia. So UAE is putting itself in a particularly sort of unique position. And what we don't know is what they're asking for behind closed doors when it comes to US strikes against Iran in retaliation for this.
So, Peter Epps, you're sitting in Tampa, Florida, near where there's that U.S. Central Command post. When you have these claims and counterclaims, the U.S. claiming that it escorted 2 merchant ships through the strait, the Iranians denying it, what do we make of that?
So I think the first thing we make is that both sides are trying to make it as opaque as possible what's actually going on. So the Iranians have also claimed that they fired at and struck 2 US warships. That probably isn't true because the Americans would find it very hard to cover that up for a long period of time. I suspect that the claim to escort 2 US merchant ships is also going to turn out to be true, not least because those ships will eventually turn their automatic indicating systems on and be revealed to be somewhere there isn't the Strait of Hormuz. So unless the US put them on trucks and took them over land, they probably passed through the strait. But what both sides are really trying to do is create very different narratives about how safe or unsafe that strait is for the rest of that shipping to get through the Gulf. So the Americans are trying to say, look, it's safe to come through because we will hit the Iranians if they try and come at you. And the Iranians are saying, look, we'll get through regardless. And we've also had reports of strikes on, I think, a South Korean ship today and an Emirati vessel as well. So the Iranian message is we can always get through. The US message, and you've seen them moving a large number of transport aircraft to the Middle East over the last 72 hours. That's always a sign that they're prepared or signaling that they're prepared to take military action. So I wouldn't be surprised if overnight we saw a really hefty bunch of strikes. The US has conducted thousands of strikes on Iran so far, just because they're not talking about them in detail. I think it's a mistake to think of this as a sort of relatively limited intervention in the sort that we were used to from the 21st century so far. We're talking 5,000 to 10,000 strikes. We're talking attack helicopters. We're talking not just drones, but we're talking lots and lots of combat airstrikes. So they could step that up again. They're quite reluctant to at the moment. Certainly European officials I'm talking to believe the Americans aren't in a hurry to get back into that conflict. But when Trump does escalate, he tends to do so pretty violently. And if they believe that they've got enough of a reason to do that from the strike on the UAE energy facility, plus these strikes against ships, plus what may well have been missile attacks against US destroyers, even if the destroyers weren't hit, I wouldn't be surprised to see a significant uptick in US strikes over, maybe a couple of day period, maybe a couple of weeks. But either way, they really want this over by the time Trump and Xi Jinping meet, and behind closed doors in both Beijing and Washington and other places in the middle, the Chinese and the Americans and the various other countries they all talk to, people like the Saudis, the Emiratis, are going to be trying to work out if they can come up with an off-ramp over the next 10 days. But I would imagine Iran's going to lose some more military infrastructure overnight or over the next couple of days. But then again, you're dancing the way out of this minefield towards some kind of deal if everyone can get there. And that's where the Chinese are going to, we'll see what the Chinese want.
Yeah, because I was speaking to one source who monitors Iranian media, who was telling me that over the last 4 or 5 days over Tehran, they've been hearing those drones again, the ones that are taking a look to see what to hit. So you're saying this is going to happen sooner than later?
Well, I think what the Americans have signaled fairly clearly is that what the Americans were telling the Iranians was, don't attack any shipping, and we won't attack you. The Iranians have decided to launch limited attacks on shipping, possibly including US warships, definitely including this energy facility in the UAE. And that means that this administration thinks a lot about restoring and maintaining US deterrence. And that means that having made that threat, they probably will feel they need to carry it through in at least a limited way. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean we'll see a sort of reopening of the 2 months of strikes we saw at the beginning of Epic Fury. But again, they'll be looking very carefully for both the Iranian command and control. There's some Iranian commanders they can kill. They'll be looking very much at the missiles and the drones that have been used, and they'll know a lot more about that than we will. They're looking at where they were launched from, seeing if they can hit some targets there, and where they were manufactured, and they'll look to see if they can hit some targets there. Since the beginning, the US has said that it has tried to say that its war aims are very simple, which is degrading Iran's ability to inflict damage on its region and push the Iranians away from doing it. And I think they're probably going to need to have another crack at doing that if they're not going to risk losing credibility.
Peter Rapp, so many thanks for speaking with us from Tampa, Florida.
It's a pleasure.